Thank you very much for the kind introductions, Aaron, and thank you to the conference organizers for the opportunity to speak on such sort of very topical and timely issue here. So we've heard a lot today about the future of work and its potential impact on working age adults, and what I want to talk about is focusing on the question of whether and how skills development can help ameliorate some of these impacts. Or I think as Louise nicely framed it this morning, how can Canada be positioned as a leader going forward in this area? So specifically, I want to talk about what the evidence on skills development can tell us about its value going forward, and what innovations exist right now that can serve as a roadmap for the future. Finally, I'm going to conclude by highlighting some implications for policymakers, focused on if we believe a skills response is part of the solution to prepare us for the future of work, what needs to happen to get us there? So I'd like to start by considering the evidence and posing the question, is training for adults effective? So the way we think about this question has evolved pretty significantly over the past 30 years. In the early 90s and 2000s, academics and policymakers generated a really large body of evidence addressing the question of whether skills training works. Now, while the result of this work was largely disappointing, its utility was somewhat limited by the fact that it focused on asking whether the offer of any skills training produced returns for the average dislocated worker. In the past decade, a more nuanced research agenda, driven primarily practitioners, has focused more on the questions of which skills training works, under what conditions, and for whom. This has yielded some significant insights about how to make training work, and we can draw on these insights to address our central question, whether and how training can meet the skills needs of the future. And to start addressing this question, I'm going to cover one model in particular, the career pathways approach, which may serve as a promising template for future-proofing our skills development policy. So, with this overview in mind, let's start at the beginning. So in the early 80s, some pioneering US research used rigorous experimental designs to start testing the effectiveness of dislocated worker pilots in Michigan, Texas, and New Jersey. What these pilots found was that there were positive impacts on earnings for lighter job search assistance activities, but that offering training to dislocated workers had no impact on their later earnings. Larger scale evaluations of training delivered through the US Job Training Partnership Act and its successor, the Workforce Investment Act, have mirrored these results at a much larger scale. So in both cases, researchers have found negligible impacts for short-term training delivered nationwide. And this echoes something Susan brought up this morning, that in the US, the evidence is focused on the fact that while short-term results seem to work, a lot of the evidence on training is pretty poor. So taken together, these studies are leading examples of a body of research that gives us reason to be somewhat pessimistic about the value of training. However, there is a more recent set of evidence that contradicts these findings and suggests an alternate conclusion. So foremost among these is a 2005 study that examined the returns to community college for over 90,000 displaced workers in Washington state. What this research found was that those who took training earned 7 to 10% more than similar dislocated workers who didn't, with these impacts ranging from 4 to 29% depending on which field of study the learners pursued. Closer to home, there's a large body of Canadian research using StatCan data that's found positive earnings impacts for adults who are engaged in training. Much of this work does focus on employed adults rather than dislocated workers, but it does emphasize that training can work for adults and emphasizes the role that employer sponsorship can play in making sure that training is effective. Finally, much more recent results of the last Labor Market Development Agreement evaluation show positive impacts for skills development programming, which are a lot larger than what we see for lighter touch employment assistance services and seem to go contrary to some of the earlier US evidence a lot of the body of research is based on. So in contrasting to earlier US evidence, these results suggest a somewhat more nuanced conclusion, which is that training can be effective sometimes. While an interesting result, it's not the most compelling. So thankfully, across both bodies of evidence, researchers have done some work to unpack when sometimes is. So one of the important insights from the early US dislocated worker pilot work was that limited choice in the training that was available to workers in these pilots and misalignments of the training with the workers' actual needs led to pretty low observed uptake on offers of training. So essentially, while everybody in these pilots received the offer, very few chose to actually pursue it. Meanwhile, in the studies with positive results that indicate training seems to have worked, individual choice to pursue training has been a key factor. The Washington State study followed participants who had all made the conscious choice to definitely enter training as an investment they wanted to make, and the field of study they chose directly influenced their earnings trajectories. Similarly, a reanalysis of the data from the early disappointing JPTA evaluation showed that a lot of people who got the offer of training didn't take it up, and many people in the control group, though they did not have access to this publicly funded training, still chose to go and find training of their own. Once these choices were accounted for, people who actually took training experienced much higher earnings than those who didn't, regardless of whether they were in the program or control group. So what does this set of evidence say? It's really that, well, the findings are sort of ambiguous to the question of, does training work? Offers of training do seem more effective when they pass a couple of tests. First, when the training on offer is relevant to workers and when they see it as being worth their investment of time, and when the training is aligned with the needs of employers and delivers skills that are needed in the labor market. So ultimately, we can take away from this that not all training is created equal. The choices of workers matter, employer demand, and the quality and context of the training are all inputs into whether or not it actually helps dislocated workers get back to good jobs. So building on some of these insights, practitioners continued to innovate and experiment with new training models into the early 2000s. The focus of this innovation was broader in that it wasn't just about helping dislocated workers switch to new occupations, but also supporting underrepresented groups to enter the labor market and helping lower skilled workers advance to better paying jobs. While a lot of innovations emerged in this time, career pathways pretty quickly stood out as a particularly promising approach to training. So at a high level, career pathways is a way to reorganize post-secondary and workforce development systems to provide a series of connected training opportunities that are aligned with industry-relevant certifications. The goal of this is to strategically combine traditional college credentials with short-term training and support services in a way that effectively prepares adults for in-demand jobs, with each step in their training pathway being clearly linked to specific career opportunities. So career pathways models really have three important features of note relative to traditional training approaches. First, they start with multiple entry points. This means that individuals can start at the point that's most appropriate to their skill level in the pathway, which means providing both entry-level access points for workers with low skills and fast-tracking access to more advanced training for workers that have more experience in education. Secondly, career pathways also have multiple exit points, which means that each step in the pathway focuses on fully preparing people for specific jobs, and once you complete a credential, there isn't a next credential you need to take to be able to enter the labor market. The modular approach lets workers pretty quickly transition to the labor market after each step in the pathway and to return to school when they're ready. The idea behind these multiple exit points that helps reduce the opportunity costs of adult workers who know they can quickly apply the skills they gain to get back to work. Finally, career pathways can integrate career guidance and supports, which make sure that individuals have clear sightlines as to what they need to do to advance their careers. And they also provide support services that help ensure participants have what they need to succeed in training and programming. So to make this a bit more concrete, I'd like to talk through an example of this approach that's being piloted right now in the home care and nursing sector by Conestoga College in Ontario. So this pilot integrates the features I've been describing into its delivery, starting with new entry and exit points to Conestoga's programming. So the pathway includes a new entry-level supportive care certificate, which is meant to encourage participation from learners who otherwise wouldn't be ready yet for the already existing personal support worker certificate. Conestoga importantly developed the certificate alongside employers to make sure that it covered skills that are actually needed for jobs in home care. So they had the option of, to make an entry-level credential, simply split the personal support worker credential in half, but their curriculum specifically chose against this, instead to make the entry-level program build skills that were needed for later modules, but also build a set of skills that were sufficient for actual local in-demand jobs on completion. The pathway is also built to enable learners to move quickly to the next level when they're ready, from entry-level supportive care jobs to personal support worker, and then from personal support worker to nursing professions. So in each level, previous training counts towards the next level of training you'd engage in through advanced placement and bridging, which helps accelerate the pathway for learners. So for example, if you complete the supportive care provider entry-level certificate, you have the option of completing a personal support worker certificate in 1 semester instead of the usual 2. Finally, because the pilot integrates academic and workforce development systems, it ensures that participants receive high-quality education and employment, but also have access to employment and placement services that have been identified as an important need to help learners then transition into the labor market once they complete studies. So this pilot's currently underway. It's supported by the Ontario Centre of Workforce Innovation, which is supported by the province of Ontario, and Blueprint is currently evaluating the pilot. So we're looking forward to some final results to better measure its effectiveness in January 2019. There's a couple other examples of career pathways in Ontario I'd like to highlight. So Conestoga is also piloting a warehousing and logistics career pathways program, which connects entry-level warehousing training to more specialized supply chain and logistics credentials. Learning Enrichment Foundation, which is a Toronto nonprofit, right now is in the process of launching a career pathways approach for early learning and childcare professions, which it provides training for early childhood assistance and bridges to registered early childhood educator credentials. Finally, NPower, which is a nonprofit organization operating in both Toronto and several sites across the US, delivers career pathways programming for in-demand IT jobs, providing training that ranges from IT essentials to specialized certifications in cybersecurity or enterprise service management. So it's worth noting that each of these examples applies to jobs that are in demand right now, and they generally apply to jobs that we expect to be in demand in the future, with the exception of logistics, which may be a bit more of a controversial sector. Unfortunately, right now, each of these is a pilot or a standalone program in Ontario that isn't funded as part of the province's standard post-secondary funding or funded as part of its standard workforce development response. So having introduced the model, I'd like to pause to sort of recap and ask, is career pathways a promising approach to meet the skills needs of the future? So as demonstrated by the Ontario examples, career pathways is applicable to a wide range of occupations, which are both currently in demand and many of whom are expected to grow. So it seems like there's a proof of concept that career pathways can deliver the actual skills needed for jobs of the future. In addition, the modular nature of the approach lets it be adaptive and responsive to changing skills needs. So while each pathway might start out with basic programming that builds the core skills needed within an occupation group, later steps in the pathway can be customized based on skills needs emerging and changing within the labor market. From the perspective of workers, the model includes features that reduce some really critical barriers to training participation, making it easier to combine work and learning, which decreases the opportunities costs and risks adult learners traditionally associate with going back to school. It also builds in supports needed for adult workers with potentially more complex needs, which are meant to reduce dropout and ensure higher completion rates. Finally, career pathways are built with employer needs in mind, and in fact require the active engagement of employers to succeed. So by definition, by the way they're designed, career pathways training is always articulated with labor market needs. So at a high level, career pathways promise sort of lies in its capacity to work as a general framework for organizing key systems for adult learners, these being post-secondary, workforce development, and support services, and organizing them in a way that meets the needs of adult learners, but also has a proof of concept in the fact that it can deliver skills needed for future jobs. So while career pathways are a newer idea in Canada, I think as Harvey indicated in his last talk, our post-secondary tends to sometimes lag behind in the ways that it's delivering innovative models, and in the US, they're currently being rigorously evaluated and applied system-wide. So in the United States, there are 2 large-scale demonstrations currently in progress, with final results expected next year. And in addition, while final evidence from these pilots is pending, US policymakers have already placed some pretty substantial bets on career pathways being the right approach to reorganize their skills development system. So a number of states have already integrated system-wide career pathways initiatives, including Oregon, California, New York, and Massachusetts, and incorporating them as a key feature of their public training response. And traction's also grown at a federal level in the United States. So a 2012 letter, which endorsed career pathways as the right approach across multiple departments, helped spur incorporating career pathways into the Workforce Investment and Opportunities Act, which essentially institutionalized it as an option available in federal training policy. So overall, the US has made some clear moves to embrace career pathways as a promising approach to be rigorously tested and have its effectiveness evaluated. And since that takes some time to produce those results, policymakers have also placed a lot of chips on it as sort of a best bet for a training approach going forward. So looking to Ontario, the province's colleges are already pretty well positioned to adopt a career pathways approach, as they've both got the capacity to deliver the high quality educational programming the model requires, and they have pretty strong connections to workforce development. However, they're constrained by current funding rules. So provincial post-secondary funding is limited to traditional credential programs, and it can't apply to the shorter or less than 1 year credentials that the initial levels of career pathway approaches generally require, nor can it cover the workforce development and support services that surround the model. As a result, this means that in Ontario, existing efforts often need to rely on ad hoc and unpredictable funding sources like workforce innovation funds. So before we jump into thinking about what to do next, let's just quickly recap. So while the evidence on research, with the existing research and evidence on training is mixed, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that well-designed training can be effective under the right conditions. The career pathways model provides a template for realizing these conditions, but there is a gap between where we are now and where we need to be to realize the potential of this approach in Ontario. So what do we need to do to move forward? I have a couple of ideas, which I'll bring out, or sort of took from other people and want to advocate for. So the first one is that we need to start thinking about skills development infrastructure that's aimed squarely at working adults. Right now, our system rests on 2 skills development pillars. The first, which we talked about in the last session, is the K-12 and post-secondary education system, which develops the skills of people generally before they enter the workforce. Beside that, we have a second pillar, our workforce development system, which supports individuals when they leave the workforce and provides assistance and training to the unemployed. This leaves a large gap for working adults, which is a serious concern given that working adults are expected to bear most of the brunt of future labor market disruption. As Gabriella pointed out yesterday, it's inefficient and in ways unfair to wait until people are unemployed before providing with publicly supported training, but the current system kind of requires this. Going forward, we need to consider approaches that'll build the third pillar of the skills training system by providing funding and supports aimed at working adults. Career pathways can provide a framework for a lot of the training that needs to be included in this pillar, as well as some other innovative potential approaches like lifelong learning accounts, but both need the right policy and funding conditions in place to scale. Secondly, post-secondary policy in Ontario is currently separate and distinct from workforce development policy. This is reflected in the way that government and funding frameworks are organized. Better coordination is needed at the strategic policy level to provide bridges between these 2 areas, and at the program level to provide funding that supports the development of innovative approaches like career pathways that blend workforce development and post-secondary training. Third, what we know now about building a future skills response is based on the research and innovation of policymakers, practitioners, and academics, and we need to continue this line of inquiry. Thankfully, there are a diverse group of Canadian actors that are already thinking about models for the future. Government-led organizations, such as the incoming Future Skills Lab, as well as existing bodies such as provincial workforce innovation centers, are already engaged in driving innovation, sharing knowledge, and promoting evidence-based models. At the same time, we know there's a great amount of bottom-up innovation, which is spearheaded by community training organizations, post-secondary institutions, workforce development bodies, and employers. Future skills agendas need to support both lines of innovation and ensure that promising pilots have the opportunity to be evaluated and scaled at a larger level. In the US, connecting career pathways to federal policy was key, and we need to think of ways to connect career pathways and other innovation to policy and funding envelopes like labor market transfer agreements. And just to conclude, while training is an important part of this future pillar, it's only one of the tools in our future of work toolkit. I think this is a topic that's been covered pretty widely today in thinking about the information, navigation, coordination tools needed to support labor market decisions and training decisions by both workers and employers. Competency frameworks should be considered that go beyond credentials and better map the skills needed in jobs, both, as we heard before, within the post-secondary system for people about to enter the labor force, but also for people who are already engaged. At a higher level, publicly funded career navigation supports are needed to help workers who are at risk of displacement understand their options for career changes and training. Existing public employment services can be strengthened to serve this role and provide guidance to unemployed and employed adults alike. While these stand as some of the key informational supports needed to build a future skills infrastructure, they're definitely not all, and I think my fellow panelists and people around the room have some interesting ideas for avenues to pursue to ensure our training system can meet the skills needs of the future. Thanks.